Okay, Baruch Hashem, Shir number 2, Basar B'Chalav, beautiful sugya. So beautiful that during lunch. I'm sorry?
I need a source packet.
Oh, the source packet for Yosef Mordechai. And thank you to Yosef Mordechai. Beautiful sugya, ad kedei kach, that I forgot about the lunch today. I was so involved in the sugya, totally forgot about the lunch today. So I ate food, but okay, so I missed you. All right, so Simin Pei Zayin Sif Beis we're going to focus on, but there are a couple Sif Beis and Gimel, excuse me, we'll focus on, but there are a couple points in Sif Aleph that we haven't touched on yet. What the Ramah says in Sif Aleph is the following: Kol Basar B'Chalav she'ena Asar min HaTorah mutar b'Hana. That anytime you have Basar B'Chalav that's Asar Midrabanan, for example, last time we had spoken conceptually about Kavush. Mirza Hashem, today we'll talk practically about Kavush, that Kavush is only Asar Midrabanan. Then the halacha is that it's mutar to have Hana'ah from the food. Hana is going to be mutar. Most poskim assume that not only is Hana going to be mutar, but it's also going to be mutar bebishul. So we're going to learn shortly, if you have Basar behema tmeya with chalav, that's only going to be an Isser midrabanan. So bepashtus, the halacha is that's going to be mutar bahana ubebishul. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger has an interesting kasha over here. Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Sifkat and Gimel says he assumes that as well, that when you have an Isser midrabanan, it's only Asr ba'achila, but it's mutar b'hana b'bishul. So why didn't the Ramah say that? So it says Rabbi Akiva Eiger something interesting. So this is a beautiful Rabbi Akiva Eiger. He says that at the end of the day, one of the Isurei D'Rabbanan are kavush. Now, if you have kavush and then you cook kavush, so in such a case it would be an Isur D'Oraisa. So hence, it's true that if you're talking about Basar Behema Tmeya with chalav, so then in such a case, then according to most, the halacha is that's going to be mutar bibishul. Leaving aside Marasayim, Ikr Dedina now. So then the Rabbi Akiva Eiger is bothered. So why did the Ramah not say Bana? The answer is what we learned last time, that if you do have something that's kavush and then mevushal, so then in such a case that would be an Isur D'Oraisa. Now it's interesting to note that this assumption that those who learn how Basar B'Chalav, Lamaisa, everybody knows this, that the halach is that what's Asar Midrabanan is mutar b'bishul b'hana. However, there's no Gemara that says that. There's no Gemara that says that which is Asar Midrabanan is mutar b'hana. In fact, if you look on the side of the page, the Taz in Sifkatan Aleph quotes that the Marshal disagrees. The Marshal Paskins called the Tikkun D'Rabbanan ke'ein d'oraisa tikkun. That at the end of the day, if it's going to be Asar min HaTorah, Basar B'Chalav, so then it would follow. We spoke about last time Basar of B'Chalav being a Geder Midrabanan, but at the end of the day, that should be also Asar Midrabanan Atu. Just like the Achila is Atu, so too the Bishul and the Ana should also be Atu. That's what the Marshal writes. And interestingly, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, which we're not going to do, it gets involved with a few sugyas that we haven't touched on, but for those who are adventurous, definitely do that. Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Sifkatan Beis proves that the pashtus of a complicated Gemara might not be as the Mordechai assumes. So this is the shita of the Mordechai, maybe the Rambam as well, that hold that the halach is an Isur D'Rabbanan is going to be mutar b'bishul u'bahana. But even though Rabbi Akiva Eiger points out that it really seems to not be mufurish in most Rishonim, and the Am Shel Shlomo is machmir, but Rav Miller, when he said over the Shiurim, said that even though the Mordechai is almost a das yachid, nevertheless we paskin like this deya, and people are noeg halacha l'maisa, that when you have an Isur D'Rabbanan bishul basar b'chalav, the halacha is that it's going to be mutar bahana, and in most instances it's going to be mutar b'bishul as well. Okay. Now, practically, we spoke about kavush conceptually. Now let's talk about kavush practically. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger over here at the end raises the following in Sifkat and Gimel, raises the following question in terms of being kovesh basar b'chalav. Are you allowed to intentionally soak meat and milk together? Would that be permissible? Can one be kovesh b'kavana basar b'chalav b'yachad? So he quotes a chumrah of the Minchas Yaakov, and I think that we can understand the Minchas Yaakov really, really well only when we do the Ramah's chumras on Sif Vav. That's going to be a whole shiur by itself. The Ramah on Sif Vav has a bunch of chumras of basar b'chalav that are what I would call chumras Ashkenaz of basar b'chalav. I think this chumrah of the Minchas Yaakov is going to be connected to that. I will explain Bli Neder then. But the Minchas Yaakov has an interesting shita. On the one hand, the halacha is that Iser d'Rabbanan is mutter b'bishul. And so therefore, what would be the problem of being kovesh basar b'chalav together? Even if it's going to have a din of bishul, clearly it's only a din of bishul with Rabbanan. And on Iser d'Rabbanan, there's no problem of bishul. Nevertheless, take a look at Rabbi Akiva Eiger. V'ligram came b'yadayim la'arei basar b'chalav lahenos mimenu ayim b'minchas Yaakov. And what the Minchas Yaakov says is that it's going to be aser. It's going to be aser to be goreim a tam of basar b'chalav through kavush. The pre-toar, it's an interesting sefer. All of you know who the pre-toar is, even though you don't know who the pre-toar is. The pre-toar is the Orach Chaim. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh, Ala Torah, wrote a sefer on Yeridea called Pre-Toar. We have a brand new edition in the Beis Medrash with the Pre-Chadash on the side as well. Many times the Orach Chaim is commenting on the Pre-Chadash. The Pre-Toar in Sadi Aleph Yud Zayin is Mekel. He says that there's no problem to be kovesh with the intention to give it to a guy is going to be permissible. Interestingly, the kasha is that the Pre-Toar here on the outline I wrote Mekel. It's a mistake. Ulam kam be-Pre-Toar Sivkat and Dalad Machmir. The problem is that there's a stira in the words of the Orach Chaim, that in his sefer Pre-Toar on our Sifkatan, he seems to be machmir. There are beautiful ha'aros on it that give a beautiful teretz. Is actually connected to some of the lamdos that we've done up until now. Ayin Sham. Okay. What would be if you would have a safek kavush? If you have a safek of whether something was soaked for 24 hours, then based on the above, that kavush is an iser d'Rabbanan, so then in such a case, the halacha is that one could be mekel, because it's safek d'Rabbanan, one could be mekel. That's what the Yalkut Yosef writes in Chelik Gimel Amud Tzadiches. One more technical thing in regards to kavush, what would one say about the following? What would one say if you had milk that had been sitting inside of a pot for 24 hours, and then you cooked with that pot with meat? What would the halacha be? So if you take a look at the Pri Megadim is in the Mishbetzot Zav at the end of Sifkatan Aleph, towards the end of Sifkatan. It's a long, long Mishbetzot Zav. So he says, Hakdeira Hashlishis. He talks about three different shilas, and he calls them three different kederos. So towards the end, he has she'ela shalosh kederos, a she'ela for three different kederos. So the third kedera over there, this is the Mishbetzot Zav at the end of Sifkat and Alf. Hakdeira Shlishis shebishla basar of lechora da'anan kaimelon kavush bekli oser kulo lo kedei klipa ayin taras chatas the isa v'heter etc. So the halacha is that would be oser bekulo. And he says, "Vanan kamelon kavush oser bekulo kli." That the halacha is that kavush would make the entire kli have a full din of chalav. So if what happens was you soaked in a parva kli milk, and the kli became entirely milchiks, and then you cooked with that kli basar, so then l'chura, what you would have would certainly be a case of basar b'chalav. That's what the Pri Megadim writes in Hakdeira Hashlishis. Interestingly, if you take a look at, I believe it's in your booklet, if you take a look some of you might have this. If you have the Bir HaChadash, Shulchan Aruch HaBihir HaChadash, or if you have the Friedman edition of the Shulchan Aruch, there is a Rabbi Kiva Eger who disagrees. He says, Nira be'enai, this is in the back of the second to last page in your booklet, Nira be'enai ein ze pashut, diyesh lomar, al yidei, kvishas hachalav lo bala hakli, kivan dehetera bala. So Rabbi Kiva Eger says that there's a Magen Avram who says that the only time we say kavush kimavushal is that we're talking about isurim that are coming together. But if you have something that was soaked that was heter into a kli, so then in such a case, Rabbi Kiva Eger argues that it's not going to turn the kli into a milchig kli, which would then, if it's cooked with fleishiks, would have that din. Now this is based on a fascinating Magen Avram in Sifkatan Tezayin, and the Magen Avram basically limits the rule of kavush k'mavushal. The words of the Magen Avram are as follows. I'm going to read for you the Magen Avram. I jotted it down. He says, Efshar, there's a Magen Avram that Rabbi Kiva Eger quotes. He gives us the Maramakom, for those of you who want to write down. The Maramakom is Taf Mem Zayin Sifkat and Tezayin Magen Avram. Efshar de me'achar de kodem zmano heteru lo amrinan kavush k'mavushal. So a fascinating approach of the Magen Avram, that the Magen Avram holds that kavush k'mavushal means that if you have iser that's soaking with something else, then it'll be mavashalit. But it doesn't work like a regular form of heat. This is a fascinating chidush. In terms of halacha l'maisa, most assume like the Pri Megadim. They assume like the Pri Megadim that lahalacha, that kavush means kimavushal kipshuto, and that means that just like hot milk into a kli is going to give off its time into the kli, and the kli becomes milchiks, and so then if you cook it with fleishiks, it's going to be a problem. So that he would say the halacha would be that way. Just like if you soaked basar and chalav inside of a kli and it absorbed the tam, so too, why should it make a difference if you soaked heter or not? That works through all forms of bishul. I leave it to you to work out, Rabbi Kiva Eger, according to that Magen Avram, a very, very interesting middle ground of kavush k'mavushal, that you don't always say kavush k'mavushal. So to crunch what we just said right now, the Pri Megadim says kavush k'mavushal means that works just like heat. There is a unique shita that Rabbi Kiva Eger pointed out that maybe not like this Pri Megadim that says if you're dealing with heter, it's not as potent. It's only when you have issa which is potent. Obviously, that requires a lot of lamdus how that would work. Okay, so this is a summary of the examples of kavush. Kavush is derabanan, to soak, to create basar b'chalav through kavush. Minchas Yaakov says it's going to be usher. It's not clear to us why, if we learned that the halacha is that it's mutter b'bishul and it's mutter b'hana. But the Minchas Yaakov asers and the Orach Chaim permits. And Rabbi Kiva Eger pointed out something very nice, that the Ramah just said the word b'hana and he didn't say the word bishul, because there is a case that, well, you have an Isser D'Rabbanan, it's going to be usher to cook, and that would be something that's soaked, and you cook afterwards. Yes, Moshe?
The shear for kavush is that it's 24 hours?
Shear is 24 hours. And that would apply in this case as well, according to Pri Megadim. If you had milk sitting inside of a parva dish, if 24 hours, so then in such a case it would be considered absorbed. Now we're going to learn a whole new set of halachas at the end of basar b'chalav, and that is when you have something that's salty or when you have something that's spicy and so on, then the rules are entirely going to change. But for just stam kavush, it's going to be 24 hours. Yeah?
The earlier Rabbi Kiva we said on the Ramah, who says that because one of the Yisur D'Rabbanan are kavush, and that way it's mevushal since D'Oraisa. Why is that?
Well, halacha is that which is kavush is only basar b'chalav midrabanan. So technically, on a level of daraisa, it's as if you have cold meat and cold milk. So if you now take something that was kavush and you cooked it, then that's an issa daraisa bishul basar b'chalav.
I'm not understanding why that's an issa daraisa.
Because at the end of the day, al pi dinei Torah, when it's soaked together, is that considered basar b'chalav? No. So now you cooked it. You cooked that which is kavush. So then you are over the issa bishul. That's the pshat. Yes, Yosef Mordechai.
Time of milk permeating this.
It already, right.
Right.
So it comes out, what Yosef Mordechai is saying is here you have a lamdus, that you could have a maisa bishul on something and be chayev for it, even though the tam was technically there, unless you assume that kavush creates a lower level of tam of bishul. And that's a fascinating question. And that might be connected also to Rabbi Akiva Eger. There might be other nafkaminas in that as well. Do you say that kavush is kimavushal pshuto k'mashmo, or not? That's it's kimavushal mamish or not? And Mir Hashem, we're going to get back to that when we discuss. There'll be more examples of kavush and Mir Hashem that we'll discuss. Yes.
The Prima Godim would also agree, even though he thinks that it's a full bishul, at least with the Gabi the Kli, you'd still think that if you were Mubashal al Eish, it'd still be also, like that would be an Isser Deresa. I mean, so that it wouldn't be bishul.
Right. So that gets into a discussion that we will get to later on. Is it considered bishul doraisa when you have blios in a kli? So there's a chuvas maritz chios that holds that you don't have bishul doraisa, but it happens to be there's another prima godim. It's going to work out nicely since you were talking about the prima godim. There's another prima godim that assumes that you can have bishul doraisa. We're going to discuss that Mir Hashem in the chumras of Sivav. This comes up in the chumras over there. Okay. Okay, Rabbosai. Now let's continue on Sif Beis. What are we going to do for the rest of the shir? So Mir Hashem, what we're going to do are the Isurei Derabanan that are part of the Gzeres HaKasav, that even though they're entirely meat or they're entirely milk, but nevertheless it's only Asr Midrabanan and it's not Asr Min Torah because it doesn't fall into the category of Lo Savasho Gedi B'Chalev Imo. And what we're going to discuss are those concoctions that are Asr Midrabanan, the implication of those mixtures, and we'll discuss Basar Marasayin, in regards to these Isurim as well. And finally, we're going to discuss Chatzi Shir because it comes up in that discussion. Sif Beis has almost no commentary. Sif Beis is Beferish Gemara. The Hashkafic points of it we'll leave for now. The Mechaber says, Gdi lav dafka du adin shar v'seva eis, lo shna b'chalav im lo shna b'chalav acheres, el shadi b'kasav b'hove. Lo shna, b'chalev aim, lo shna b'chalav acheres, el shadi b'kasav b'hove. So it doesn't matter whether it's in its mother's milk, even though the Torah said its mother, and it doesn't matter whether it's goat meat or it's any other type of meat. However, in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber says, "Eina noeg elo b'bsar behema Torah b'chalav behema Torah, avol b'sar Torah b'chalav tmeya, o b'sar tmeya b'chalav Torah, mutarim b'bishol u'bahana. Ubasar chayev va'of afilu b'chalav Torah mutar b'bishol u'bahana, va'af ba'achila eina asla midrabanan." So here we have these types of the meats that are exceptions to the rule, that the Gzeres HaKasav does limit to a Gedi, which is Behema Tahora, in contrast to Behema Tmeya, that is not going to be subject to Basar B'chalav D'Oraisa. Let's take a look at the Beis Yosef and Beis Gimel. Mishnah, Basar Behema Tahora V'chalav, Behema Tmeya, Basar Behema Tmeya, V'chalav Behema Tahora, Mutar Levashal, U'mutar Ba'ana. So the Mishnah already, it's a machlokas tanaim. The Gemara over there quotes a machlokas tanaim, but we paskin like the Manda Amar Rabbi Akiva, who says that the halacha is that it's going to a chaya is going to be also midrabanan. Of is going to be midrabanan, and the behema tmeya and chalav tmeya are also going to be only aser midrabanan. Okay, so bottom line is that these things are going to be midrabanan in Isser Basar B'chalav. I mentioned that this is the Shita Rabbi Akiva. If you take a look in the Beis Yosef, he points out that the Shita Rabbi Yossi Aglili is that Basar Of is an Isser D'Oraisa. Basar Of and Basar Chaya is an Isser D'Oraisa. It's not going to be a midrabanan. Not only is it the Shita Rabbi Yossi Aglili, but based on the opening sugya of Perak Kol HaBasar, there is an important Tosos over there on the first blot, where Tosos also points out that the mashmos is that there is an Isser Ha'alah, that you're not allowed to put chicken next to milk on the same table. And that seems to be assuming also that Basar Of is going to be an Isser D'Oraisa B'chalav. Because why would we make a Gzeira if it's only an Isser D'Rabbanan? The Lashon of the Mishnah is Kol HaBasar, all Basar. That seems to indicate even Basar Of. So, Tosas is Shita on Kuf Dalid, who quotes the Marmikomos of the Tosas. It's on Kuf Dalid, I do. On the outline, Dibra Maschel Of. So Tosas on Kuf Dalid on the base Dibra Maschel Of does actually paskin like Rabbi Yossi Aglili against the psak of the Tur. So the Bach also discusses the merits of this psak, and should be noted that even though we learned in Shulchan Aruch that Basar Of B'chalav is only Asar Midrabanan, the Shita of the Balei Tosas is that it's going to be an Isser D'Oraisa. In fact, there's language of some of the Rishonim that since there are many, for example, if you take a look, the Bach collects them in Sif Katan Beis. Towards the end of Sif Katan Beis, the Bach, for example, quotes, Mikol Makom Kosha Adavar Lahakel Keneged Das HaTosvos. It's difficult to be makel against Tosas. It's even the Pashtus of the opening Mishnah, some argue. And the Ago Shari Dura writes this. I saw the Ezer Shulchan says the Trumas Hadeshin is no telechumra. So interestingly, although the standard psak is definitely this way, and it could be that according to the Rambam, someone who paskins Basar Of B'chalav is D'Oraisa might be over on Baal Tosef, but nevertheless there are those who disagree, who hold that it is a din D'Oraisa. So Rav Nebenzahl Shlita told me that he thought that Bnei Torah should be choshesh for this opinion that Basar Of B'chalav is D'Oraisa, and that I think the nafkamina would be Dinei Safek, but again, it's only B'Torah Sachumra because it's clear that the Stimas HaRambam, Stimas HaShulchan Aruch, and so on, is that Basar Of B'chalav is only Midrabanan, but there are strains of those who are choshesh for the Shita of the Balei Tosas. So even though it's black on white in Shulchan Aruch, that's going to be Asar Midrabanan, and therefore Mutter Bahana and Mutter Bebishul, but nevertheless there are those who are Machmir. Yeah.
What in that case, let's say you did a suffix with let's say Basar Of and Chalav. If someone was Machmir on that, wouldn't it lead to a kula about Tashlis, let's say, or would that not be about Tashlis?
Yeah, I think he would say that if it's a kiyum, if it's someone who's being consistent and he's being mekayim a chumrah, that he's being choshesh for the Balei Tosas, that would remove Baal Tashlis. Even though we should be more careful about Baal Tashlis in general, but I don't think that would be a problem. Okay, that's the first point in the Beis Yosef. Point number 2 in the Beis Yosef is the Beis Yosef asks a very, very sharp kasha on the Tur. What did we learn? We learned that the Tur said that when it comes to Basar Behema Tmeya, so then in such a case, it's Midrabanan Asr Bebasar Bechalav. So take a look in the Beis Yosef, Mikol Makom. This is the Beis Yosef towards the end of Beis Gimel. Beis Yosef says, Mikol Makom, Masha Kasav Eino El Midrabanan, Lo Matzi Koi Elo Lechayev Va'of Bechalav Tahora. Di'ilu Basar Tahora Bechalav Tmeya, Ubasar Tmeya Bechalav Tahora, Lo Ashkachan Shiyasru Chacham Bachil Mishum Basar Bechalav. V'gam lo hayelem inyan leso midervreim achar shekvar aser v'omed minatora mishum b'sar tamei or mishum chalav tamei. Frek the heilige Beis Yosef gavaldige kasha, gavaldige pshat kasha on the Tur, and that is, he asks like this. He asks, how can you say that this is basar b'chalav midrabanan? What do you mean? It's already aser to eat. It's already aser to eat. And what's the halacha? It's mutter bahano bebishul. So in what way are you adding any isser at all? It's true. And if the halacha would be that it would be aser bebishul bahana, so then I understand that you've added a new basar b'chalav. But here it was already aser to eat minatorah. So what do I need to say? That's basar b'chalav midrabanan. What have I added at all? You hear the kasha on both sides? Okay. So you have the Tur, the Beis Yosef's kasha on the Tur, And the Bach gives a very sharp answer. Comes along the Bach, and the Bach says like this. The Bach says, in Dibra Maskul Mashikosav Einanoik, Va'afal pi, he defends the Tur. Va'afal pi shekvar osruhu min haTorah nafkamina le'inyan chanan. The Kaimel Rabbeinu Ephraim de lo amrina chaticha nas nevela ela basar b'chalav. So as we spoke about last time, the rule of chanan really only makes most sense by basar b'chalav. So if I have basar behema tmeya, and it's going to fall into a kedera, it's going to fall into a bunch of other pieces of meat. So then the halacha is that I'm going to be mishar the isser only based on the nevela shaba. I'm not going to be mishar except for the amount of tam nevela that comes out. However, when it comes to basar b'chalav, there, what did we learn? That if you have a drop of milk that falls onto meat, then we said the halacha is going to be mishar keneged kol hachaticha, not just the tam basar b'chalav, mishar keneged kol hachaticha. That's the magic of chaticha nasis nevela. So says the Bach very sharp. The Bach says that if it's only going to be asur based on the idea of tmeya, so then in such a case, then you be mishar the isser keneged the tam tmeya basar beima tmeya that's coming outside. But once you'll have basar beima tmeya that has milk on it, so then in such a case you'd have to be mishar keneged the entire chaticha, which is going to aser. That's nafkamina number one. Number two, he says, is the din of chaticha ruya l'skabed that we learned last time, that the halacha is that chaticha ruya l'skabed only applies to basar b'chalav. It doesn't apply to shar isurim. So then, in such a case, you would have, there are many instances it won't apply to shar isurim. The example we gave last time is if you had tam of basar behema tmeya that went into a kosher piece of meat, so then in such a case, then only the tam basar behema tmeya is going to take into account for bittul. And even if it's in a chaticha ruya l'skabed, it will still be batal. However, if you have basar b'chalav in a chaticha ruya l'skabed, so then when it's mixed up with other pieces of meat, then it's not going to be batal based on the din of chaticha ruya l'skabed. So what the Bach has done is he's defended the Tur. The Tur said that basar hema tmeya is going to also have the din of basar b'chalav. The question is, who cares? It's already asar b'achila. So what way did you add any din of basar b'chalav midrabanan? The answer is that when it comes to basar b'chalav, you'll have the added din of chaticha nas nevela, and when it comes to basar b'chalav, you'll have the added din of chaticha ruya l'skabed, which would not apply in many cases of basar behema tmeya. And the Shach quotes this in his Perish. Let's take a look at the Shach. Shach is very beautiful in Sif Katan Gimel. So the Shach quotes this, and then he adds his opinion to this. So this is a great example. This is our first Shach that we're doing Keseder. So this is a great example of the making of a Shach, if you will. So what a lot of times you don't realize is that when you jump into a Shach, is that there are usually things that have been going on prior. So in this case, you had the Tur's cryptic statement, so that at the end of the day you have basar b'chalav and basar behema tmeya. In what way did you add any yisr? So that's the Beis Yosef's kasha. Comes along the Bach, and the Bach answers by saying there is a nafkamina, because now in this piece of meat you have chaticha nas nevela and you have the din of chaticha ruya l'skabed that you might not have had just stam by basar behema tmeya. And with this the Shach picks up. So let's pick up with the Shach in the middle of Sifkat and Gimel. El Shabach Hisigalav Upirish Datur Asla Shaminan to Mikal Makom Midraban Asam Mishum Basar B'chalav Nafkaminan L'Inyan Chanan the Svirle De'enu Ela Basar B'chalav. The general rule is that it only applies to Basar B'chalav. V'chein L'Inyan Chaticha Ruya L'Skabed, and that's what we learned last time, that generally you don't have Chaticha Ruya L'Skabed as frequently as you do have by Basar B'chalav. If you don't understand that nafkamina, you could leave that. If you understand Chanan, That's perfect. V'chein pirush hadrisha lefiza afilu didan dekaim lo chatir nasaveh b'cholisum haminafkusa b'davar leni mashkasav arav. So then the Shach adds that even though the Ramah in Siman Tzadi Beis says that we paskin chanan by Shari Tzurim, but there are many instances that the Ramah is mekel by Shari Tzurim and only by Basar B'chalav. So therefore, in those cases where you would want to be mekel by Shari Tzurim, you won't be able to if you have Basar Behema Tmeya that's cooked with milk. Then the Shach gives his own opinion. Says the Shach, I reject this. The lesbu isur mishum basar v'chalav klal afilu midrabanan v'gam ein tam klal shechachom yasru mishum basar v'chalav. Says the Shach, why would Chazal come along and say that it has a din of basar b'chalav when we're talking about basar of b'chalav? So then ein achanami. Chazal came along and said, here it's mutter, the oaf is mutter. When you cook it with milk, so then it's going to become basar, the basar that's asr. Because it was mutter up until now. But basar be'ema tmeya is anyhow asr. So why would Chazal have made, it's true, in theory you'll have these nafkaminas, says the Shach. But Chazal would make, only are going to create the gzeira where it makes sense to create the gzeira. They're not going to create the gzeira just for a nafkamina of chaticha nasis nevel. They're going to create an iser when there's a reason to create a geder, like when it comes to basar of b'chal. But when it comes to basar be'ema tmeya, it's already aser, says the Shach. The bishleim basar of shaykh shapir gzer shema yochlim basar of b'chal v'yochlim gam ken basar be'ema b'chalav. Kudekas Rambam. Aval ma inyan ligzer she basar be'ema Torah b'chalav tmeya o ipcha. There's no reason to make a gzera. So ultimately, the Shach sides with this Beis Yosef. So what a beautiful back and forth. A tour that didn't make any sense. The Beis Yosef's kasha, a brilliant answer of the Bach, and the making of a Shach. The Shach comes along and the Shach says it's a sharp chap by the Bach, but the question is whether that's necessary at all. In other words, it doesn't make sense that you create a chefta basar b'chalav and basar be'ema tmeya. Basar of b'chalav, it makes sense that they created. And the nafkamina, of course, is what the Bach was metaretz for the tour, that you would have chanan and you have chaticha rudiskabe. It comes along the Shach, and the Shach rejects that. Yes?
Can you defend the Bach by saying the very nafkaminas are why you need it? Because I get confused.
Yes, you could come along. Very good, Yudadov. I am partial to the Shach, but Yudadov says, even if we're partial to the Shach, at the end of the day, let's just spell out that it is possible that, according to the tour, that Einachanami, there's no need to make the Gzeira per se, because Basar Behema Tmeya is already Aser, in terms of looking at the Isser. But what we want to do is strengthen Basar B'chalav. We want to be consistent in Basar B'chalav. Anything that looks like Basar B'chalav has all the dinim of Basar B'chalav. And all the dinim mean that's going to have the din of Chatich Nas Nevel Ru'il Iskabed. That's how I would formulate it. You were formulating a little differently?
Yeah, I was saying a little differently. They might get confused with meat in those cases of Hanan and Chatich Ru'il Iskabed.
In other words, because you'll think it's Basar Behema Torah, some will think it's Basar Behema Torah.
Or what will think that if that's mutter, then
people will work backwards. They'll think that if it's mutter b'Torah's Hanan, so then in such a case, then right. You're saying it as a Gzeira Atu, and I'm being Masber conceptually. Essentially, I think we're really saying the same thing. You're giving what maybe the reason we would say it, and I'm saying conceptually it's neater to put into the same category. In other words, once it becomes Basar B'chalav, then in all instances we give it all the dinim of Basar B'chalav, even when it was already Aser. Yes?
According to the Torah, it says that there's an Isser Derabanan by Chalav Tmeya, Behema Tahora. What about a case of Behema Tmeya and Chalav Tmeya? Does it apply also in that case? Like the Isser Derabanan?
I would imagine yes. I would imagine yes. Now, we're going to discuss, as far as I know. We should look around, but as far as I know, the answer is yes. I don't see why there should be a difference between the two. It's a nice question. I should have thought of that question. I wonder if some of the nafkaminas that we're going to discuss shortly will be connected to that. Yeah.
So we're saying that according to the Basar Torah, that Hanan would apply to Yisrei Durabanan. So that applies.
Right.
Would that apply by, let's say, meat and milk that are
Very good. So that we're going. So put kavush aside for a second, but Siman Tzadi Beis, there's a big discussion about Hanan and Yisrei Durabanan in general. That Mir Hashem will discuss. Okay. These are all Gemaras. These all start with the Gemaras, and then the question was, did the Gemara intend that there should be a din of Hanan or not? That the Gemara says that Basar Behema Tmeya with Chalav is going to be Asr Midrabanan. But there's something that the Gemara omitted, which the Gemara probably shouldn't have omitted in terms of its preponderance, and that is Basar Nevela. Did I make the point to you about tray food? I made the point to you about tray food, right? So we said that most non-kosher food today is nevela. So this comes up, and this was not discussed, but it was discussed backhandedly by the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos. This is not discussed in the Gemara, interestingly, and the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos introduced one of the most razzle-dazzle ideas in all of Isser V'Heter. Anybody who learns Isser V'Heter needs to know the Nekuda Nefla of the Rambam. It's absolutely beautiful Nekuda, and there's so much that's packed into it. And the Dagomer Vava quotes it on our page in Sif Katan Aleph, as well as the Pischei Tshuva in Sif Katan Vav. And the Nekuda Nefla goes as follows. It continues, it flows from our topic in Sif Gimel. In Sif Gimel, again, we spoke about something that was already Asr and you added milk to it, and then we said that it's going to be Asr as well. The question that we discussed prior is, why do you need to Asr it? But now we have the following permutation that doesn't fit neatly into anything that we've had up until now, and that's Nevela. Nevela and Chalav is going to introduce an interesting problem, and that is the following problem. If you have not kosher meat that's mixed with milk, so there you add a new Isser. What's the new Isser that you add? An Isser of Hana'ah. The Nevela was not Asr B'Hana'ah. It was already Asr B'Chila, but was not Asr B'Hana'ah. And if you cook it with milk, so then in such a case, now you have a new Isser of Hana, in theory. Now, when it comes to B'chalav Tmeya, there the Gemara told us, Beferish, that it's Mutter B'Hana. So there's nothing to talk about. But what about when it comes to Basar Nevela? Now, Basar Nevela, in theory, could be Asr B'Hana, because the Torah never said that it's not Basar B'chalav D'Oraisa. So it is Basar B'chalav D'Oraisa. In that way, it fits neither in the classic Basar B'chalav nor in Basar Behema Tmeya. And that we don't have any information about Beferish from the Gemara. Comes along the Rambam in two places. The Rambam is quoted in the Dagomer Vava in his Pirush HaMishnayos and Maseches Krisos. I always found that it's a little easier, not a lot, but a little easier to teach the Nekuda Nefla from the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs. The Rambam writes the Nekuda Nefla in the Sefer HaMitzvahs and Mitzvah Kuf Pei Zayin, and the Rambam writes the following. The Rambam starts out, and this point is going to be important as well. This is going to be a debate between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Rambam writes that a person will get malchus if they cook basar b'chalav and if they eat basar b'chalav. And he sets up the notion that hana'ah is not subject to malchus. Because the Rambam says that, as we're about to see inside, that hana'ah is really not mefurish bikra, it is subsumed under the Isser of Achila. Now the Rambam goes on to ask, then if that's so, then why do I say Lo Salash Gedi B'Chalev Imo 3 times? It should only say it 2 times. Ayin Sham. He gives an answer over there. But the Rambam's Chiddush, in his Nekuda Nefla, is premised, number 1, on the following idea, and that is that Hana is really under the rubric of Achila. If that's so, comes along the Rambam, and he's mechadesh the following chiddush, and then we'll see it inside. Nekuda nafla, the Rambam says, is that if you have nevela b'chalav, even though you should have argued that the nevela beforehand was mutter b'hana, and when you cook it with chalav, then it becomes aser b'hana. But the Rambam says, since the hana stems from the iser achila, so we continue the rule of ein iser chal al iser. Since hana is not an independent iser, according to the Rambam, we have the rule of ein iser chal iser. Let's take a look at the language of Rambam, mitzvah kuf pei zayin. I encourage you as well to look at the Pirush HaMishnayos. By the way, the Pirush HaMishnayos is a little bit different than the Sefer HaMitzvos. I would love to discuss with you and say the differences, and if there's a way to be miyashev. They come out the same way, but they say it in quite different manners. And I was la halacha, there's no nafkamina between the two, but it's interesting how the Ram formulates it there versus here. But let's take a look at Sefer HaMitzvos. Ubikan, after he writes that there is Iser Malkus on Bishul and Achila, Ro'ili she'ermez al shorish gadol, in the Pirush HaMishnayos he calls it the Nekuda Nefla. Shelo kadam zichra. He says no one has said this, has spelled this out before me. V'zeh she'amr yisbarach lo savasha gedi b'chalev nichpa b'torah shalosh pamim v'amr melamdei apir shekol la mehem hu le'inyin amr chad la'achila v'chad yisra ena v'chad yisra bishul u'lemakshe she'ikshe v'yomer le'eze davar miniach yisra achilasa v'yisra bishul shtei mitzvahs v'lo simne yisra enasa mitzvah she'ish hina yada maksha. So he says, the Rambam says that you'll ask me, why did I not count hana as a separate mitzvah, even though it's written 3 times? So you should know, she'isra hana ein roi sheyimne mitzvah f'nei atzmo mipnei shehu v'isra achila inyan echad. It's considered one isser. Sha'achila min mimine hana, because really achila is just a type of hana. Va'amri misparach b'davar shu lo yachal. Omnam hu dimyon midimyone hana va'kavan shlo yehene lo ba'achila v'lo b'zulaso. So it's included as one iser, and therefore there isn't a separate set of malchus. V'u amra al apostle kol makom shnem lo sochol. This is the din of Rabbi Avo Psachim Chafal from the base. Echad iser achila ve'echad iser hana b'mashma. And then the Rambam spells out in the Nekuda Nefla. The Rambam spells out as the Dogam Revava writes. Now we can move over to the Dogam Revava. He writes, Mavur halfway through Sivkat and Aleph. Mavur sham b'divrei Rambam she'ena aser b'hana ayin shah b'nekuda nefla shabir sham. And he says, he says it even early. I'm sorry, he says it out more explicitly earlier, right in the beginning of the Sivkat and Aleph. Ubasar nevela v'chein chelev asal vashal b'chal min hatov local bishulo avol ba'achila ein bo iser basar b'chalav v'chol zeh mavur b'Rambam. So the Rambam says that you're not going to have a new iser of hana on this chefza if you cook it. So therefore, what comes out is, according to the Rambam, that we say ein iser chal al iser when it comes to this nevela, and once we say ein iser chal al iser, nevela that's cooked with milk is going to be mutar b'hana. That's the chiddush of the Nekuda Nefla. Before I take any questions, is this clear, Rabbosai? The Nekuda Nefla is clear? First clarifications. Question. So let's start with you, Yudah. Yeah.
I was wondering, I know we spoke out a little more luminously that Basar Chal takes on a different chalos than it was beforehand.
Right.
So why can't we know that once the nevela is cooked with the chalav, and therefore it takes on the new chalos, and it's not iser chalos.
So the answer to that question is that hagufa, that when it comes to the new chalos only starts when you've created an isra achila. If you haven't created an isra achila, so then in such a case there's no new chalos. You could look at it the way you had said, or you could look at it the other way. Just so that, but you know what? I think everybody followed. But I just want to just mention to you as a maramakom on page Lameches Lametes in Rav Genak Sefer the Gan Shoshanim. So there he spells out how the Nekuda Nefla works, and if there's anything that's not clear, it'll be my pleasure to say it again. Okay? So far so good. Everybody has it. Yes, Moshe.
There's also no Isser Bishul by Nevela with Chalav?
Oh no, Bishul there will be. Why? Because Bishul is a separate independent is an independent isser. So there you would say isser would be halal isser. So
bring all of them together? Is that not like
no, because hana is a subset of achila.
meaning that can't bring on the status of that, like you were saying. Once it's official, then the chalos should be cut.
That depends on how far you push the relationship between the bishul and the achila, ein achanami. So maybe you could draw some conclusions as far as that's concerned based on that.
The Rambam makes a very strong connection.
Right. By the way, Rabbi Genak raises a similar type of issue in the piece. Take a look. We'll reference also in terms of Rav Genak's psak as well. So l'chura, this was always a beautiful lumdishus sugya. However, it has a I'll start with the fascinating practical application for us, and the practical fascinating application would be the following. And where Rabbi Genak taught it to us, he taught it to us in Halach L'Mais in regards to the OU. Do you need to have an OU on your dog food? So, if you hold, why would you need to have an OU on dog food? Because when you feed your dog, you're getting hana. So there's no problem that if the dog food is fleishiks, that it comes from Basar Nevela, you're allowed to give non-kosher flesh to your dog. But you're not allowed to give him Basar b'chalav. So what happens if this was cooked, the dog food is cooked on a milchik run? So if we paskin like the Nekuda Nefla, the answer is no. If you paskin against the Nekuda Nefla, then the answer might be yes. Interestingly, the Pri Megadim over here, in his Hakdama, quotes the Rambam's Nekuda Nefla. He puts it actually into the Rambam Perek Tes Halacha Vav. It's the Pri Megadim is in the Psicha Dibar Maskul Ula Inyan, and similarly the Piskei Tshuva in Sifkat and Vav makes reference to it. And then he quotes the Rambam Mefurish. He starts off with the Rambam in Perek Tes, then he quotes the Rambam in Krisus. But he claims that there is a Rajba in the Torah Sabayis that's cholek on this. The Dogam Revava just says that there's a Tosos that you could be mefalpel how he comes out. But the Pri Megadim claims that there's a Rajba in the Torah Sabayis that says a similar case. The Rajba is talking about fat that's cooked with milk, so it's essentially the same thing. The fat chaylev that already has an Isser Achila, would you have an Isser Mosif on it? And the Pri Megadim claims that the Rajba holds that it would. So he comes out that it's a machlokes between the Rajba and the Rambam in the Nekuda Nifla. And therefore, if you take a look in Gan Shoshanim, let's take a look at page Mem Aleph. I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. And Yehuda and Moshe, he connects it. This piece is his piece about the Tar Chefza Basar B'chalav. So he discusses the Nekuda Nifla in that context. I encourage you to look at it. And he concludes, Ubazmanenu, take a look at the last paragraph of Mem Aleph. Ubazmanenu matzah ma'od shema'achal ha'klavim ninkur b'chanuyos hu basar nevel mevushal b'chalav. V'kivan de la Pri Megadim v'chasam sefer, we'll get to it shortly. Kasha l'hakel kedas ha'dogam revava. So he says, even though dogam revava seems to be no telekula, so Rabbi Genak says that you would need to have an OU on your dog food. That could probably made the OU a couple $1 million. I mean, the OU makes lots of money giving hashkachas also on things that might not even need hashkacha. I was saying this in shul, and someone picked up the tissues. The tissues in our shul have a hashkacha, Reuben hashkacha. The tissues in Mishkafayim are under hashkacha of Reuben. So I'm not sure why they have a hashkacha. But well, at the end of the day, look, it keeps NCSY Kola going, so I guess it's worth it. But at the end of the day, there are things that what's been proven market-wise for companies is that it's in they believe that having an OU helps the product sell better. So the question would be, is it just that they're putting it on, you don't need it at all? Or do you need it? So here Rav Genak felt that it was kedai to say that you actually need it. I think the OU will put their hashgacha on things that don't technically need a hashgacha as well. Again, as long, I would imagine there's no mekachtos. They explain to the companies when they need and when they don't. But some of the companies just say that it's worth it for us anyhow. But here he argued that one should have a hashgacha. What's this chsam sofer that he quoted? So the first shaila was not dog food and an OU, but the first practical example that we have a record of in our Shulchan Aruch is the chsam sofer in the Pischei Tshuva Sifkatan Vav. So again, the Pischei Tshuva starts with the Dogma Mervava, mentions the Pri Megadim. The Pri Megadim found a Rajba, and the Chsam Sofer runs with that. So if you take a look in the parentheses, Ayin b'tshuvas Chsam Sofer shenipishal gam ken al inyan zeh, and he quotes from the Me'il Tzedakah, who wrote the Sefer Kanfei Yona, sha'umnim irvu chema b'chelev lasos mehem neiros, that there were companies that were mixing, in those days the candles were made out of animal fat, and they were mixing butter with the fat, because fat was very expensive. In other words, if they could get away with putting 30% butter and 70% fat instead of 100% fat, then that would be good for them. So Yesh Lomar, so the Chsam Sofer says, "Lefi dener shel chelev einam asuyim mechelev akloyos v'aker levad, d'marav mem kama mini chalavim krum she'en b'hem karis v'im kein shakper ika basar b'chalav mishum taruvas dahanu chalavim." So he says there's a concern that these fats are actually nevela fats, not the iser chelev mamish. So then, in such a case, the halacha would be that it would be us. You now have an iser ana, even though there already was an iser achila, but in such a case, it should be aser. And he concludes that even though the Dogma Mervava said that you could be mekel, the Chsam Sofer says avol I kamei didi asi, but they would have come and asked me this shaila, ani oser, I would have asered. So the Chsam Sofer says he would have asked. By the way, even the Dogma Mervava was only mekel. Take a look at the Dogma Mervava. He was only mekel. L'chein hasomek al zeh b'makom hefsid lo yafsid. So even the Dogma Mervava was only mekel b'makom hefsid. So this is the fascinating application of this razzle-dazzle, fascinating lumdus that has many, many implications. Number one, in regards, just to sort of spell out the scope of the Nekuda Nefla. On the one hand, it's a fascinating chiddush in terms of ein iser chal iser, and it's also a chiddush in terms of how you look at the iser, the relationship between the iser hana and the iser achila. And as Yehuda and Moshe pointed out, it could get involved with how you look at the general chefza of basar b'chalav in general. And what comes out is this fascinating chumrah. And if you want to see more, Rav Genak Shlita quotes the way Rav Soloveitchik was masber the Nekuda Nefla, which is, I think, essentially the same way we just said it now. Yes?
According to the Nekuda Nefla, how do we explain the Gemara's meaning at Russia to be reminded the case of Basar Tnei? Wouldn't that also be, why wouldn't we just also say Iser Chal Iser?
Right. So in other words, the way we started off the shir, the way we present in the shir is we first learned Basar Behema Tmeya, and we said, so there the Gemara already took care of it, and then we have classic Basar B'chal of Limahadrin, if you will, and then you have this in-between case of Nevela, which is amorphic, and you have a lot of Lamdasha possibilities. But you're saying if the Gemara already knew that the din of Ein Iser Chalal Iser would apply, so then in such a case, why would I need the din of the Gzeres HaKasus? So first of all, you would need it for Bishul. For Bishul, it wouldn't apply. The question is whether that teretz is Mukhrach in the Gemara. The answer that I'm giving you, whether that's Mukhrach, that was what was pointed out to Moshe's question. It was a good question. The Yisur Bishul does apply according to the Rambam. The question is whether my answer is Mukhrach in the Gemara. We have to work it through. Good, it's a nice, good ha'ara. Rabbosai, another application of the Shitas HaRambam is the Tzlach's approach in regards to the Shiur Isser, and this takes us into the world of shiurim by basar b'chalav. And what we're going to discuss now, basically, so you have clear what we've done. So let's just do a review, just for the sake of contextualizing everything that we've done today. Is we first pointed out that Isurei D'Rabbanan don't have an Isur Hana, don't have Isur Bishul. We gave some practical examples of kavush, of Isur D'Rabbanan of kavush. We then went on to Basar Of B'chalav, and just gave a little bit of background that there are shittas that hold that it's D'Oraisa. And then we spoke about Basar Behema Tmei with Chalav Tahora, and the possible reason why we need to discuss whether there is entirely Basar B'chalav there or not, where the Shach says there's no Basar B'chalav, but the Bach holds that there is Basar B'chalav. And then we moved over to Nevela and see, when it comes to Nevela, is there Basar B'chalav by Nevela, and the Hashlacha for that. Now that we're done with that, we're going to go to the halachas of shiurim of basar b'chalav, but I'm going to continue with the strain of the Rambam and the Ramban. So we're starting a new topic, but because the Rambam and Ramban is so seminal, it actually becomes another nafkamina, and that will take us into the halacha of shiurim by basar b'chalav. The Pischei Tshuva in Sifkatan Beis, Dibra Maschel, the Isser Hana, the Pischei Tshuva over there quotes a fascinating tzlach. And the tzlach says as follows. He says, what would the rule of chetzi shir be in regards to hana? We know that the halacha is that the chetzi shir is asar b'achila. We're getting closer to Yom HaKippurim, and the Sugyas and Yuma discuss chetzi shir, that you're not allowed to eat a shir on Yom HaKippurim. The Gemara says one of the explanations is chazil tzterufe, but at the end of the day, of course, those are shiurim, no pun intended, quote unquote, shiurim b'fnei atzman, and the din of chetzi shir. Fine. Chetzi shir applies to achila. That applies to achila. What about hana? Is it going to be connected to the din of hana as well? Am I allowed to get hana of basar v'chalav b'chetzi shir? So take a look in the Pischei Tshuva. I'll pick up from a little bit in the middle. We're going to jump around in this Pischei Tshuva. Sifkatan Beis. Here it's a little bit in the middle. V'ayim b'tzlach b'psachim dafchav Beis. V'achakach kosev b'pshitus. D'latam haramam she'ena loka al hana. V'aday li'inyin iser gam chatzi shir aser ba'ana min haTorah. According to the Rambam that says that the Isser Hana and the Isser Achila are Hainu Hach. So if you have a din of Chatzi Shir by Achila, then by definition you can't separate the Isser Hana. However, the Pischei Tshuva quotes in the beginning that the Ramban disagrees. The Ramban disagrees with everything we've been discussing up until now. Because the Ramban holds that just like you get a separate Malkus for Bishul and Achila, so too you get a separate Malkus for Hana as well. So the Ramban is not going to disagree with the whole Nekuda Nefla from an entirely different angle, because he holds that the whole assumption that you separate the Achila from the Hana is incorrect. So says the Tzlach, if that would be so then in such a case it could be the din of Chetzi Shir is a din dafka in Achila, as not a din in Hana. So that's you have to go through in the sugyas of Chetzi Shir and Meseches Yuma, whether that's mukhrach or not. But that's what the tzlach assumes. The tzlach assumes that the din of chetzi shir was given to us by achila. So if you have achila and hana being one din, so then it's mistaber that once the chetzi shir of achila is going to be aser, so too the chetzi shir of hana. But if you're going to say it's a separate world, ad kedei kach that gets own malchus, different than what we saw in the Rambam in Mitzvah Kuf Pei Zayin, so then in such a case argues the tzlach, then it could very well be that chetzi shir is a din in achila, it's not a din in hana. So that's an interesting application, segueing in to the halachos of shiurim. Similarly, the Pischei Tshuva quotes a Tshuvas Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Simin Kuf Tzadi writes that when it comes to hana'a, hana in general, in Isra Hana, any type of Isra Hana, Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes the shear of the cheftza of Isra Hana is a pruta, and it's most achronim assume, the Pischei Tshuva assumes, and it's kamat mefurish in Rabbi Akiva Eiger himself, that this applies for Basar B'chalav. So here you have something fascinating, Rabbosai. What is the shear of Basar B'chalav that you would get Malkus on? The answer is Pashut or Kizayis. What would be the shear that you would get Malkus on for Bishul? The answer is Pashut or Kizayis. What about the shear when it comes to the Isser Hana'ah? So the Pischei Tshuva quotes that Rabbi Akiva Eiger holds that that's a pruta. Why? Because Hana is not measured through Dinei Achila. Hana is measured through value. And the value is a pruta. That's what Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes in his Tshuvas. Interestingly, Rav Reichman told me it's about to be printed. The Rishimas on Chulin are about to be printed. So I had the schus this summer to go through pieces with Rav Reichman. So he showed me a piece from Rav Soloveitchik where Rav Soloveitchik argued that he thought that this would be talui in the Machlokes Rambam Ramban. In other words, that if you hold that the halacha is that achila and hana are separate things, so then in such a case there's room to say that when it comes to hana, the shear is going to be a shava pruta. However, if you're going to say that achila and hana are really one, and the ikar is going to be the achila, so when it comes to basar b'chalav is going to be defined by the shir achila, which is a kizayis, so then the shir hana is not going to be a shir hana of a pruta, but it'll be a shir of a kizayis. That's how Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal supposedly said it. Rav Reichman, when I walked in one day, Rav Reichman was very excited about it because he said he thought that this was a very big chiddush. Until we found this Rabbi Akiva Eiger, Rav Reichman said you could be mefakbek, that even though the halacha is that the Isser Hana in general its shear is going to be a Shava Pruta, so what would an example of that be? The first example I could think of an Isser Hana is, let's say, Me'ila. So when it comes to Me'ila, so then in such a case, the Isser of Me'ila is not related to food. The Isser Me'ila applies to everything. It applies to tables, applies to phones, and so on and so forth. So then it makes sense, so then when we're talking about it, that the shear is not going to be in terms of a kizayis, but the shear would be as defined by a pruta. However, when it comes to Basar B'chalav is starting out as a food. It's creating, like you said, a chefza basar b'chalav. That starts as a chefza of food. So then even Rav Reichman argued that he thought that this was a big chiddush until we found Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rav Reichman was surprised that the Rav even said this. That at the end of the day, that you could argue, even according to the Ramban, that it's a separate isser. Hana is a separate isser, but that separate isser is on an ochel. So if it's on an ochel, then the shear is going to be kizayis. So fascinating extension of the Rambam that started off the Nakud and Afla are all these things that are being discussed in the Pischei Tshuva. Yeah?
So does that mean that Hana by Basar B'chalav is fully defined by the amount that you're having enough from? So in theory, you could have like an unlimited amount of Hana from like a very small amount of Basar B'chalav? Correct.
That's right. If you have something that would be less than a kizayis, let's say you had Basar B'chalav, in the fanciest restaurant in the world, that the dish goes for $1,000, and you know how it works. The fancier the restaurant, the smaller the portion. So at the end of the day, so then in such a case, so it would be you get hundreds, thousands of prutas worth, but if it's less than a kazayis, then in such a case it would not be an isser. That would not be the shear of the isser daraisa. Nacham. That's what the chura would come out. Gishmak. Okay. One more point another point or two in regards to shiurim. Chetzi shir in regards to bishul. Yes?
Clarification and then question. The Rav said that according to the Rambam, the shir of Hana would be kazayis?
Rav Soloveitchik? Yeah, that's how I recall Rav Reichman saying it to me.
But didn't we say that according to the Rambam, the Pischei Tshuva says that according to the Rambam, even the Chatzi shir is Asur b'Hana? So it doesn't matter, because according to the Rambam, you don't get malchus anymore.
Right, no, but
Chatzi shir is also.
Okay, yeah, so that's a conceptual problem. Okay, Eina Chanami. It's a conceptual problem, but that at the end of the day, at the end of the day, according Lu Yitzur, you had a shita that held that you would get malchus, and that would be the question. Yeah, Eina Chanami. We didn't. It's not a nafkamina for malchus, but it'll be nafkamina. What's the shir daraisa? Other nafkaminas. What is? No, there are times that a shir daraisa has other ashlachas outside chatzi shir. What would be considered for Toma V'Tahara or something like that? Other things outside of that. And that was the clarification question?
Yeah.
Good, okay. So in regards to Chetzi Shir by Bishul, so here there's a couple of fascinating questions. The Pri Megadim in his Hakdama, in the end of Dibra Maschel V'Kama, that's towards the beginning, the Pri Megadim raises the following. Let's do that piece. Let's do V'Kama. V'Kama Yivashel V'Shir Bishula Shayaloka. How much do you need to cook, and what is the size of the food that you need to cook to get malchus? Hine Shir Bishul Keshir Achila. So when it comes to Bishul, there's no reason to assume that's not the Shir Achila, and he proves it from the Rambam, and therefore the Shir is going to be a Kizayis. But skipping a couple lines in the Pri Megadim, V'Shir Bishul Lo Nizbar B'Rambam. But the amount of the Shir Bishul, now we'll see in a moment what we're referring to when we say the word Shir Bishul. U'b'Gemara Sham Amru be'eze Bishul sha'acherim ochlin. V'kasa Pri Chadash kol shelo have kamachol ben drusai ein iser. So the Pri Megadim raises the question: how much do you have to cook the basar b'chalav in order to be chayiv? So you guys know that in Hilchos Shabbos there's that big question. In Hilchos Shabbos, are you chayiv by mevushal kol tzarko, or are you chayiv for Michael ben Drusai? So the Pri Chadash says that up until Michael ben Drusai, so then in such a case, the halacha would be that you would not be chayiv. So the fact that you heated up the food, the milk, and the meat together, and tam was given inside, even if tam was given, but if it hasn't reached Michael ben Drusai, then it's not considered bishul to be chayiv. However, interestingly, the Kreisi Uplesi quotes those who disagree. If you take a look, the Pischei Tshuva, by the way, made reference to this Plesi, if I remember correctly. If you take a look in your photocopies towards halfway through, if you take a look at the Kreisi Sifkatan Gimel, he quotes the Pri Chadash, Sifkatan Gimel, Dasa Pri Chadash, Dimlo Nispashal Kumechel B'Nisoi De'ein Asar Min HaTorah. Va'ayin Plesi, he quotes himself, that I'm going to say later on, the Leisa, Kol Sheba Lechom Kli Rishon Asar Din Torah. So this is something I want you to keep in mind later on as well. Because here's the question. When do you have to be concerned that you've created basar b'chalav? Is it the moment in which hot and hot come in contact with each other, the moment in which basar b'chalav are cooked with each other, even if there isn't Michael ben Drusai, or in the first moment it'll already be considered a basar b'chalav, or is it somewhere in between? So just remember it this way, that the Pri Chadash quoted by the Pri Megadim says that you need to reach Michael ben Drusai to create basar b'chalav, while the Kreisi has a very strong argument. He quotes the Kanfei Yonah again. He quotes the Kanfei Yonah, who says that the moment in which they touch, they're going to be asar. V'amevin yavin, that l'chura, the sugya of tipas chalav, that when something fell in and then you immediately took it out, seems to indicate that you don't have an elongated bishul process, that it happened relatively quickly. But according to the Pri Chadash, you have to reach the stage of Michael ben Drusai in order to be chayiv. However, the Pri Megadim says that, even though the Pri Chadash says that, let's continue on the Pri Megadim. Umil ladina evar lekaman, as I already said, devadai kol shenafal chatichas basar kli rishon v'husar miyad asa bechila v'ana after lekashlish bishula ulemalkus itmar de'en loke ela derech bishul. So the way in which the Pri Megadim reconciles this problem is the Pri Megadim says that you won't get malchus if tam is given off. That's even though in Siman Sadi Beis, once tam is given off, then it's considered basar b'chalav. But in order to get malchus for bishul, then it would be only by Michael ben Drusai, and then you could be mefalpel. What about going from Michael ben Drusai to Mavushal Kal Tzarko, as we discuss in Hilchos Shabbos? And then the Pri Megadim concludes this discussion that Umasha Kasa Pri Chadash Shlish Bishula Rashi Lo Pirish Kain Elish Nespashal Kol Tzarko. So he points out that even though Pri Chadash assumes that it's Machal Ben Rusai, he says the mashmos of a Rashi is that it has to be Mavushal Kol Tzarko. And the Pri Megadim concludes, but in terms of Isra Achil, Isra Ana, even if it's not Mavushal, even if it's not Machal Ben Rusai, as long as Tam is given over, so that you're going to be chayiv. So what comes out is the machlokes between the Kresi and the Pri Chadash is, do we say that Bishul took place in the moment in which Tam is given off? The Kanfei Yonah, the place he say, yes, Al Pi Halacha, that's already considered Bishul, while the Pri Megadim says you have to look at the regular rules of Bishul. The regular rules of Bishul are either Machal Ben Rusai or Mavushal Kol Sarko. It's an interesting question. What about Chetzi Shir? So that gets involved in the sugya of Chetzi Shir as well. In other words, if you hold it's Machal Ben Rusai, is it usher to do it mitam Chetzi Shir? That would get involved with the general sugya of Chetzi Shir. Yeah?
What do we pass in terms of when you get malchus?
So in general, we would generally be choshesh l'chumra. When Mirz Hashem, you remind me, when we do tzadi beis, when we see that even if you take it out very quickly, it's still considered basar b'chalav. So we'll see if where we could bring rayas. I thought the pashtus was like what the Pri Megadim presented. Dahainu that there are two dinim. One din is whether you considered you did bishul doraisa, a full-fledged bishul, and that maybe you need the shir machal ben drusai, versus whether there's tam, you already have to be choshesh for the earlier. But I could hear both sides. In terms of how we're machriya, generally the Pri Megadim is considered a very, very strong posek. But and fortunately and unfortunately, we're not passing on Malkus today, so it's really not yet Lamaisa. Yeah?
But did Rabbi say the din was for Achila and Hana for the Pri Chadash?
So the Pri Chadash says that the Pri Megadim adds the Pri Chadash. Even though the Pri Chadash holds, it's not considered Bishul until Machal Ben Drusai, but certainly if you have Bishul where there was Tam Basar and Tam Chalav, then it would be Asr Ba'ana and it would be Asr Ba'achila. That's what the Pri Megadim. And that'll be even Doraisa.
Though it's not. Even though we need Bishul and that's not considered Bishul.
That's what the Pri Megadim seems to be saying. That's what the Pri Megadim seems to be saying. That's the chut.
The distinction between Derech Bishul and it's a Bishul in the whole the Torah goes from Lashon Bishul.
So I don't think it's pashut at all in Hilchos Basar B'chalav one way. But let me bring a raya to what you're saying. We learned a Beis Meir, that the Beis Meir held that if you have Kli Sheni, since it's not Derech Bishul, so then in such a case, he says it's only going to be Aser Midrabanan. So he assumes that if you don't have real Bishul, then you don't have a real Basar B'chalav at all. You don't have Basar B'chalav at all. And you're pointing out that it sounds like that the Pri Megadim is saying that even though you haven't had a Bishul that's going to give you a Maisa Malkus, but nevertheless, but I would say that there's a chiluk between, you don't have to go so far, because I think the svara of the Pri Megadim is like this. The svara of the Pri Megadim is that you're doing a Maisa Bishul. This is a Maisa Bishul. It's a Derech Bishul. It was enough to be considered to give off Tam. However, it's not considered a full Maisa Bishul. To get Malkus, you have to do a full Bishul. And to be considered a full Bishul, you need to do Machal Ben Drusai. I haven't thought about this enough, but L'chura, that's what comes out, the dichotomy. That's what it seems to be, the dichotomy that emerges. An interesting din. Okay. Rabosai, should we push ahead a little bit? I always like to hear where your head is. Should we start Marasayan? It'll be about another 20 minutes. What would you be? How many people would prefer to stop? Feel free. How many people would prefer to go on? Okay, so Mirz Hashem, next time we'll pick up with Marasayan by Basar B'chal. That'll be Mirz Hashem Thursday. Don't only focus on that. The next few shachs are not easy, and we're going to do them inside Bli Neder. So, for example, the shach Sifkatan, I'm in the right place. Shach Sifkatan Dalid and Zayin are important, and And the Mirza Hashem, we're going to go through, we'll start, I very much would like to do Beitzim already as well. And Sif Dalid, Chalav Isha, it's a little bit confusing, that. And then we'll go to the Chumras of Ashkenaz in the Ramah.